I'm going to present some of my previous work in the context of what I'm doing, particularly in the context of critical geographies of just transitions, and hopefully it should plug into what some of these discussions have been happening at this summer school. Green deals were mentioned a lot in the previous days, and it's a word that we hear a lot about. So we have the European Green Deal, we have green deals across the world. I should say I will be primarily talking in this presentation about events in Europe, Eastern Europe, Central Europe, a little bit of North America. I am not going to be talking so much about the global South, as I am deriving most of my research today from those areas. So we hear a lot about green deals. So there's green deals in Europe. There's green deals in North America, proposed from all parts of the political spectrum, from the right to the left. Everyone wants to do a green deal now, and everyone wants to do just transitions as well. So we now have the Social Climate Fund being established in Europe. Previously, Just Transition Fund. So we have just energy transition funds, actually in South Africa and so on. There's lots going on everywhere around green deals. And what's really interesting about this is that they're not necessarily coming from one element of the political spectrum. So there's lots of left-wing progressive Green New Deals and sort of you even hear the red the different kinds of green deals, but then you also have green deals coming in from more of the political right or the political center, because really the kinds of proposals that the European Commission has been putting forward around the Green Deal in the last 4 or 5 years are really not necessarily coming from a left progressive perspective. They are much more center to sort of neoliberal initiatives. So you look at all these initiatives and you look at all of these transformations, and what's really interesting around them, wherever they are in that political approach, is that they really expand the meaning of what we think about as just transitions. And briefly to recap, and maybe this was mentioned before, just transitions came from a very specific kind of political debate that's more than 40 years old, primarily linked to the trade union movement, primarily linked to green jobs, but it has really evolved in the last 30, 40 years. As Darren McCauley and Raphael Heffron say, it's now come to identify a much wider range of forms of justice, from climate, environmental justice, the more equitable energy justice, a more equitable process of moving a post-carbon society. And in that sense, a lot of these proposals, whereas previously the debate was a little bit what some people might call reactive, so it was about really reacting to situations that were happening on the ground, reacting to the loss of jobs as a result of green industries. Now it's something different. Now it's actually a proactive approach. It's saying we have to manage the transition process. We have to address what's happening in relation to climate and energy so as to achieve greater degree of justice. So they're more interventionist in that regard, and they combine a whole range of different forms of justice. So what I'm going to be talking about today really is that these just transition projects and these green deals, which by the way have been convincingly critiqued quite a lot now. There's a paper on the necropolitics of the Green New Deal, which is sort of, I think, in a similar vein of critique here. I'm talking about the European one. What I'm really going to talk about not so much that sort of political element, but the spatial element, because I'm a geographer. So as was shown yesterday, as I managed to lose a few people on the way to the restaurant and back. So I am definitely a geographer. So I'm going to talk about this sort of spatiality of the Green Deal And I'm going to talk about also the unanticipated geographies that emerge when we bring together energy justice and transitions. So it's not just that they are spatial projects in themselves, but they also fundamentally transform space through the interventions that they implement. Um, and here, I'm a little bit inspired by our dear friend Vanessa Castanbrotto in saying that those just transitions go beyond just things like location. It's not just where they happen, but also they influence the places, they're influenced by the places where they happen, and they include things like territory, scale, landscape. Territory being the political spaces where transitions happen, scale being the different levels of governance where transitions happen, and landscape being the combination of material, social, and infrastructural elements against which they happen. So, in essence, really, there is a critique here, right? And the critique is, in that geographical thinking, is that when we talk about these just transitions in the energy sector, there is a deep neo-modernist, a capital-centric, patriarchal, and neoliberal vision of those just transitions deep inside them. And that remains unchallenged. That remains outside of a lot of debate. So, the kind of contribution and debate I want to make, I want to instigate today is precisely around some of those lack of reflections on that. A lot of things that we accept for granted as being good. I'm going to get to that, by the way, where I think that is. I should add also there is a colonial vision, which I'm not really talking about here, but I think some of the discussions at this summer school have really opened up. And I'm going to focus particularly on energy efficiency, right? And so energy efficiency, everyone agrees we all need it. It's a great thing, right? We all need better energy, better insulated buildings. And as an energy poverty researcher, that's what I've been arguing for my whole life, and I still argue about it. But some of the ways in which we do energy efficiency, some of the assumptions that are embedded in this process, and particularly the implications of energy efficiency investment in that broader spatial context remain unchallenged from a critical point of view. So I'm going to try and open that up a little bit. Maybe I'll be a little controversial because everyone likes energy efficiency, but somehow maybe I will open that up for discussion. So I'm building on a few papers that I and other colleagues have published. One was in Antipode on just transitions, the political ecology critique, and earlier a paper on low carbon gentrification in IJA. And last year we published with Caitlin Robinson a paper on injustices at the air energy nexus, environmental planning F. So those papers come together. I will briefly also talk about the labor question in the making of energy efficiency as a resource, and that's something that is in a paper in progress. So these are all sort of articles that have dealt with this question in different ways, which I'm going to talk about. They are, if you're struggling, if you're really struggling to fall asleep at night, they're good. They're very good for sleeping. I would love to recommend them to you. Altogether, you don't need any pills ever again. Right. So, what is the just transitions and why am I critiquing it? So, obviously, a lot of the discussion, even now in that just transition context, is on the economic impact. Jobs that are lost in transition. So if you look at the debate around, for example, coal regions in the EU or how we move towards the green sort of sector, it's all about jobs. It's all about managed decision making as well. That's like a lot of the debate, even in the Green Deal, how we manage this process through a sort of techno capitalist managerial framework. So there's not a lot of debate around what that politics is, or if there is, it's again managed sort of its engagement with the local people about transition. Um, a lot of it is about the supply side of energy. So a lot of it is right. Let's see what kind of fuels we're gonna replace. So okay, we have too much coal, we have too much of this. So bring all the green energy. So there isn't much about the demand element. So I'm just really going to be talking about the demand side of energy. So as Fowler has argued, now that's kind of improving a little bit. Capitalism, the fact that this is happening in a capitalist political economy, isn't really part of a lot of this sustainability transitions research. And the possibility of dissensus, of contestation, remains limited. So, because obviously it's a fantastic thing to have just transitions, right? It's like a term that's so broad. No, you can't be possibly against it. It's fantastic to have a Green Deal. And a lot, if you think about then what it is about, like the interventions, it's the sort of there's particularly with the notion of justice, it's about a sort of immunological sanctity, as Maria Kaika would say. So it's about the marginalization of some radical imaginaries, because it's all managed, right? So you have a clear just transition plan. You have a strategy how to get from A to B to C. So it's when you talk about then justice, it's that sort of lovely triad: recognition, procedure, distribution. The discussion around the politics of that remains outside of the purview. And yet, if we think about the spatialities of just transitions, right, you have to think about how you engage with the contradictions of capitalism, right, the capitalist political economy in which they occur, but also the household itself, because the household, or the family, to use an older term, is not immune to, it's also reflective of this political economy. And a lot of the interventions that are happening, aside from taking place in a capitalist political economy, because they're drawing on the same resources and they're taking place against the same landscape, they're also intervening in the everyday biopolitics of the household. So that element is very often not discussed in the literature. The displacements that happen as we move our energy systems from one system to another are taking place across a whole range of sectors, but also different levels, different scales, and different time horizons. All of those have implications on how energy is used and lived. And in that sense, space is not a passive container. So these transitions don't happen against just the background of a geography in which there is nothing. Space itself influences the transitions themselves. So that rescaling of those transitions is messy. So you could say, if you quote Sally Marston, there is a flat ontology here. There's an ontology of scales that transcends just the local or the regional or the national. It all comes together. So you have to have those tools to understand them. And underpinning this really, and now I'm going more onto the demand side, I think is a particular imaginary of the home, particularly imaginary of retrofit and the smart home. So what does that really mean, right? Well, first of all, smartness, energy efficiency is something that's seen as universally beneficial. So the number of funding calls that I have seen, and they're still going on behavior change, right? Behavior change for smartness, behavior change for sustainability. That's just out of the roof these days. Everyone wants to do behavior change. So it's not changing the systems, the practices, the scales, the political economies. No, it's the behaviors. It's the behaviors of those who are in the home, and they need to be smarter and they need to be more efficient. There's something else here which I, as a geographer, abhor, and that's idea that once you get into the home, once you get into these interventions, you have to draw boundaries and frontiers around them. So there are practices of at least things: you bounding, parsing, quantifying, adding, and mutating. Is that 5? Yeah. Not very good at counting. I thought it was 6, but no, it's 5, right? So bounding, you have to put boundaries around the home. You have to put boundaries around the objects of your interventions around energy efficiency. You have to parse it. So you have to decide, are you counting this? Are you counting that? Are you counting particular types of energy saved? Are you counting this type of intervention and so on, you have to quantify everything, you have to add it up, and you have to mutate it. So you have to be able to convert the units of energy that are being saved into other forms of units. So that is okay, but there's a lot of metrologies going on in all of these interventions, right? Those metrologies are not politically neutral processes. They are themselves reflective of a neoliberal political economy. So to do the metrological elements of energy efficiency, you have to have lots of assumptions around behavior, around what is counted, what and why you're doing this. And I don't want to go into this debate. Elizabeth Schoaf has written a great paper about the metrologies and the quantifications of energy efficiency, but it is really there at the kernel of these interventions. Now, what's also really interesting, and that always happens in a neoliberal economy, right? Neoliberal economies love to create new markets. So when you're able to quantify, bound, parse, do all of these things, you create markets out of nothing, right? So something that was there, that was just in the home, used whatever in a particular way, now opens the possibility for creating markets where you can have commodification, aestheticization, trading, and so forth. So Sarah Knus has written some really great stuff around this. The other implication of this smart home imaginary is that you start to reify the home and the domestic as a unit of intervention. So you start to think that the home, the household, is where all the problems in society happen. It's not the political economy of capitalism. It's not all of these unsustainable practices of exploitation, of power, of extraction. No, it's the home and the household. So, and particularly to go back to the energy poverty debates, it's the home and the households of poor people, of disadvantaged people. That's where a lot of this intervention happens because it's their energy efficiency that needs to be improved. So to go back to Rees in this context, you could say that if you take all of this as a whole, it reproduces the status quo by other means. So it's another way of reproducing the status quo. So, and by the way, I should say, we all need to be sustainable, energy efficient. But when we do it in a capitalist political economy, there's always this danger of reproducing, of doing the status quo through a different approach. So that's something I would say underpins a lot of this debate. So there are three wider strategies here, that the three implications that I would like to analyze here. So one is the idea that you bound and you enclose energy use in the home, right? So that means that energy use has to be, in a way, demarcated from in the home from everything else. In some ways, that requires the separation of the natural and the social worlds of the home. So you are basically in the home as a social unit, and you're keeping a particular form of nature outside of the home because you are intervening in the home in that sort of bounded way. It requires then also the demarcation of temporal and spatial horizons. So what you are doing here in that context is you are saying, right, the interventions that would happen are going to happen within so many years, within this particular spatial context, within this particular political or technological fix, right? It requires the introduction of new technologies. So you have to bring in more technological investment through all kinds of new devices into the home to improve energy efficiency. And of course, behavior change is a really important element of this. And so rather than changing the structures, we're changing behaviors. And again, this work has been done on this, but the behavior change debate is incredibly pervasive. And it comes from a particular strand of behavioral psychology, potentially, but now it is at the core of a lot of these domestic energy interventions. It's technology plus behavior change. When we think about scaling up, and I will show you some of that in a moment, it's a very linear process. So you insulate a number of homes in this area, and then you move on and you insulate a number of homes in another area. So you go through a kind of process where you treat these units, homes or neighborhoods, as discrete. So essentially, you are starting to think, right, these neighborhoods are equal to those neighborhoods, and it's just a number of counting the interventions that we're doing. There are some other implications as well around what happens with gender, because a lot of these interventions do not open up what happens inside the home, particularly in relation to patriarchal power relations that might exist within households, because you are reifying the household as a unit of intervention. And in relation to energy poverty and in relation to particularly disadvantaged groups, this again is a lot of the focus around these green deals and justice. The very important element of this is that poverty, particularly energy poverty, is treated as an epistemic object. So it's reified again as a unit of analysis linked to particular types of indicators, linked to particular types of behavioral or other technical interventions. Its structuralness is erased through the process. I'd like to just say, when I put these strategies on one side, that there are also counter ways of doing it. Even if we go through the literature broadly and not just transitions, we can see, for example, that someone like Henry Lefebvre talks about makings and becomings. So it's not just about a linear process or a bounded process. It is about a dynamic, uncertain, inherently uncertain process. Or we look at this lovely article by Doshi in Area, where she talks about embodiment, which she talks about circulation, right, as a sort of the basis of a more feminist political ecology. Or we'd look at Eric Swingedau's work on metabolic processes, right, where we start to open up this question of metabolic processes being never innocent, being never something that is bounded by only one scale, something that connects across scales, something that holds enabling and disabling possibilities. Or we look at work by Day Beeler and Simon, the paper that I have cited in everything that I've ever written, which is fantastic, which talks about the permeability of the home, how the home is never a bounded entity, how everything that we do connects in the home, connects to everything else, and that indoor spaces themselves hold infinite political possibility. And a really interesting paper by my colleagues, Harriet Larrington-Spence and Sashka Petrova and Ali Brown in Area, where they talk about permeability and protest in relation to the home, that how the home in this sort of energy space can become a site of generative political transformation. So I just want to highlight this really interesting work because it opens up, it contrasts for me how we might think of all of these smart home energy interventions, energy efficiency, whatever you call it, in a more politically progressive way, and in a way that does not erase the inherently power-laden but also permeable space of the home. Okay? So other than that, right? So we had this sort of element of physical material interventions. Another set of strategies is about discursive framings and enactments. And to me, this is supported by a whole range of academic work and a whole range of actual political calls for projects, for interventions. Now, I should say that some of this work is not inherently, how shall I say, most of this work is not really inherently regressive politically. It has the same goal. It wants to solve injustices in relation to energy. It wants to move us to a more sustainable transition. But the problem is it operates within the same political economy of capitalism that reproduces, that creates these injustices, right? So I think this quote from Cooper is really interesting in a book on just transitions, published some years ago, where it says, the current crisis is part of an evolutionary process that capitalism, progressive capitalism, has repeatedly successfully navigated in the past. Okay? Justice is consistent with the history of a progressive market economy. I don't know what that means. So we need to achieve justice in the energy sector while preserving the dynamic economic and social forces of progressive capitalist markets, right? So this is not so innocent, okay? I'm giving this intervention as an example of cases where there is an explicit framing to work, to do just transitions, to do energy interventions within and explicitly with also the political economy of capitalism. I am also thinking, right, of a project which I will not name, which just says, we produce knowledge and innovations to advance behavioral change for an inclusive and equal European Green Deal. A large new project, okay? Maybe someone's in the room from it's a great project. I love the project, okay? But I just saw this framing and I think, okay, so you're going to look at people who are vulnerable. You're going to look at people who are disadvantaged, facing hardship, but you're going to try and change their behaviors, right? So that suggests really that the problem is with them, not with the actual political economy, not with the political choices that have led them to become vulnerable. No, it's them. They are the problem, and we're going to change their behaviors, and then we're going to have an inclusive and equal European Green Deal. This is a book by my respected supervisor, Brenda Boardman, who led me in this work. And then she published a book called Fixing Fuel Poverty, right? And I thought, no, please, why did you use that title? Because the idea of fixing is precisely that. Through smart home imaginaries, through interventions that are bounded, past, focused, you fix the social ills of society. You negate the political embeddedness of these ills. You negate the power relations, the patriarchy, the hegemony, all of that. No, you're going to fix through technical interventions. And then I saw this European Commission call, accelerating the climate transition in difficult context. Transition super labs. Yes, problem solved, right? So we're going to have a super lab and we're going to find a difficult context. The context is difficult. It's those people who are difficult, right? We're going to fix them. We're going to put a lab on them and we're going to solve the problem. I can talk about, I could do my whole lecture just giving you examples of this. Everything right now, all of the calls that are coming out, all of the funding, research, landscape, the policies are operating under this language. And what's also a real problem, again, I hope these people aren't here, great paper, scaling up low carbon urban initiatives towards a better understanding, published in Urban Studies. So what are they saying, right? We've got an initiative here in the Netherlands. We insulated some homes, did whatever, right? Now we're going to take that and we're just going to do more of it. We're just going to scale up. So scaling up is about just doing more of things differently and in different places. And if it's a difficult context, we'll do super labs or whatever. So there's a sort of naivete about space, which is the idea that it is all linear, that operating in one area is the same. So so there's these lovely projects where you have follower cities. So Lighthouse and Follower, I don't remember now. lighthouse and follower cities. So there's lighthouse cities which are in the west of Europe and follower cities which are in the east or somewhere else, right? And the lighthouse cities do their interventions, and then the follower cities follow them in the same way, right? Because it's the same, right? So just there's a sort of, they need to learn, but it's the same sort of intervention. So I could talk about this forever, but all I'm saying really is there's a particular discursive frame, not just a material frame, as I discussed earlier, but a discursive frame to the critical to the articulation of these just transition at the current moment in time. Underlying this further is something I would argue even more pernicious, which is the financialization of energy efficiency. Because once you start to treat the home, to pass the home, particularly of the poor, but everyone really else, as a resource, you discover something where you can actually do some interventions. So you can create new spaces of capital accumulation, new spaces of extraction and accumulation. So I'm just going to quote from IJ Global, and the URL is energy efficiency, have your cake and eat it. Okay? So a sleeping giant with an appetite for many billions of investment every year. Green giant. Sorry, I forgot that. Like the bean, there's the beans, right? Green giant. So obviously, great new capital investment horizon. International Energy Agency. Capital backing energy efficiency will match and then overtake renewable spending by 2030. Almost $1 trillion forecast for the sector by 2040. So new horizons of investment and a new resource, energy efficiency becomes a resource in itself, to quote Gavin Bridge. What are some of the types of interventions that we're seeing in this process of ascetization, to quote Keith Birch, of energy efficiency? So either both the acquisition and the refinancing of existing yielding assets, so things that already create capital returns, but also the financing of new efficiency projects that are backed by long-term contracts. So one of the good examples, not so recent, not so new, but already happened, is this Santander BNP Paribas joint venture, where they are providing mortgage loans and personal loans, specifically around energy efficiency. Or Deutsche Bank issuing bonds to fund residential energy efficiency. So some of these things come with strings attached. New forms of ownership, new forms of financialization inside the home. They're not as naive as we might think when these capital firms come in, right? I'm just going to show you a slide to show you some of the big capital investors that are going in. We have this is emergent research that we're doing. There are around 45 large corporate entities active in this sphere. These are profit-making entities, and they're going to be profiting off what we think is a good thing, right? It's a good thing at some level, right? People are going to have more efficient homes, but who they're going to be paying back and how they're going to be paying them back, that becomes really important. So what are some of the asset classes that are being securitized and which new asset classes are created? So mortgages to green buildings, so low carbon energy efficiency, net zero. Car loans to electric vehicles and hybrids, and loans to green and small and medium-sized enterprises. They're all things that have been securitized. But there are new asset classes that are being created. So, and this goes a little bit beyond energy efficiency, but things like solar, small-scale assets on homes that are being part of this investment, biogas, hydro, hybrid projects, loans for energy efficiency upgrades, and battery and storage projects. So people People then, these loans that are taken, then split up, securitized, and sold, and then they are essentially part of a neoliberal market. Right. So I'm going to try and think about what the outcomes or what the implications are for people, particularly for vulnerable people, for just transitions. Do we really have a just transition process going on here? And who is going to end up basically disadvantaged from this process? So the one process is what we might call the green securitization of the residential sector. So effectively what that means is that people's homes, people's everyday practices are being assetized. They become part of a market through the aid of a materially intangible resource, something that they cannot see or feel, something that is inherent in their behaviors, right? And dependent on their behaviors. And then this has implications, of course, in terms of when and how people's flexibilities, people's everyday practices are being shaped, people's everyday vulnerabilities are being shaped. Okay. Another one is the sort of the technical and legal standardization of the home. Now, that in itself maybe is a necessary process, right? But the more that happens, the more then you have the entrance of these new markets into the home, into the private sphere of everyday life. There is then the question of these non-energy benefits, the creation of further markets, right? Better comfort, better indoor health, increased building value. But then what happens when and how, but who gets to have these investments, who doesn't have to have these investments? What are the implications of people moving? Do loans stay with them? Do loans stay with the house? What sort of areas get the investment and so on becomes really interesting. And then it becomes, also creates a really interesting situation for energy companies because they become the producers of less of their product. Okay, so this has a particular political economy because flexibility starts to be a currency. So what happened this year, and I can give you an example of the UK, is that a company started paying consumers for not consuming energy in a particular hour, right, of the day. So that was just a pilot, but it was a very successful pilot. So it's really working with this idea of demand response, but it's the assetization of flexibility, right? But the turning of flexibility into a particular form of capital. Not everyone is able to be flexible and to turn off their heating or energy at a particular hour of the day. For a whole range of reasons. There might be disabilities, small children, older pensioners, and so on. So all of a sudden, a particular group of people, through this process of assetization, become advantaged in the new political economy, right? Imagine what happens then if the people who are more vulnerable have a particular loan to pay for upgrading their home. That makes them vulnerable even further. So there's a whole range of new inequalities emerging in this process of green securitization that we don't fully understand. But I don't see this as a benevolent process. There's something else which I want to talk is really these new forms of injustice in a spatial context. And this is something I've been working on a little bit more, right? And the key thing is, with the reification of the home as a site of intervention, you start to intervene not in the neighborhood, not in the city, not in the community, but the environmental performance of the home. It is the performance of the home and its occupants through this particular political ecology that become the sites of intervention. So that again individualizes these injustices. And of course, then you create a capital accumulation strategy predicated upon what happens in the home. So I'm going to tell you a little story now, which is in now 7 years or 8 years ago, we were doing a research project focusing on energy poverty in Poland, in the city of Gdańsk. And so we were in the city government, and they were telling us about all the brilliant energy efficiency investment schemes that they had, all the sort of great improvements. And at one point they said, oh, but there was this one area where we actually had to evict the residents because of the energy efficiency investment. And we just went, what? Sorry? Rewind that a bit. So it turned out that there was a process of gentrification and eviction and displacement as a result of these upgrades happening in this particular economy. So I'm just going to tell you a little bit about that story because I don't want to be talking forever and I want to leave some room for questions. So it was in an area. So we then went and did research this because it sounded like we stumbled upon something that wasn't really that known at the moment. So we went there, did interviews in this area, which was Gdańsk in Poland. Maybe someone is from there, so I don't need to tell you. But Gdańsk in Poland is a city. It's a sort of a large port city, part of a wider urban agglomeration. In the city, there are quite a lot of old industrial neighborhoods. The result of many interventions. This is a historical city that went through all kinds of transformations in the past. So there is one area near the kind of the urban core, the medieval. Well, it's reconstructed. It was rebuilt because it was all bombed out. But then they rebuilt the urban core. But then there's like an area between that there and the sea that was sort of former industrial area with some housing, and the city really wanted to redevelop that, right? So there was some housing in that area, obviously very attractive location. So this is where that took place, and so we went there to do interviews, and we went to online forums, neighborhood meetings to figure out what was happening in this area called Letnica. So just to show you, so like this is the old core of Gdańsk. This is the Martwa Wisła, which is a river going into the Baltic Sea, like a distributary of the Vistula River. And it was this area over here that was a site of intervention. And you will notice there is a stadium there. So that was the stadium built for the Euro Championships. Obviously, they really wanted to upgrade the area. So energy efficiency and energy investment was used as one of the kind of the vehicles through which this process happened. The area is from the 19th century and was really interesting kind of situation there was because under communism there was this particular policy in Poland and other countries to invest in particular types of housing, right? It would really be this sort of socialist panel block housing that would get a lot of the investment. And bizarrely, one of the large powers, what these housing estates would get was district heating. And one of the large power stations for that was nearby this area, but the area never got the combined heat and power, the district heating. So people were really cold in these houses, in these old houses, which were neglected for a long time, and it was a really kind of low income area, and it was underinvested in as well. So this is kind of what it looked like. Just before it was renovated as well, the renovation started. So historical area with these sort of two-story housing blocks from the 19th century. Yeah, then it was renovated, and they were building the stadium opposite, and this is what it looks like now. And you think, wow, they've really renovated it. Looks lovely, right? But it was done in a particular way, and the way it was done was, I think, for me, exemplifies, even though there was not that much private capital involved, like some of the other examples I gave you, it exemplifies the ethos of these interventions, the sort of passing of the home, the privatization of the home, and so on. Now, I don't know how comfortable you are answering questions, but I usually, when I show this photo to my students, I say, can you spot the difference? These are two pictures that are, there's like a before and after of the area. So I don't know, can anyone spot the difference? Anyone? Sorry? They demolished some of it, exactly. So they demolished a lot of the housing. They improved the facades. Anything else people can spot? Yes, they moved all the cables indoors because it was energy interventions. Anything else? I don't know if you can see this, but all the green spaces were enclosed. There's lots of enclosure happening, right? So to me, this was really interesting because it was all about enclosures. Everything was about putting everything inside the home, enclosing it, encasing it. That permeability of the space that existed there before, which could have been built on, was destroyed. And that permeability also translated into the political domain. People were not consulted. There was no discussion, right? I'm not saying that consultation is necessarily a panacea to these problems. Here, there was no consultation. It was because it was done for people's good, right? Who doesn't want to have more energy efficient homes, to get their bills lower, to have electric stove and what have you? I'm not going to read these quotes, but they're sort of quotes from people who are saying that this was not a very democratic process. I should add, and I forgot to say this was municipally owned housing, right? So this was so people in this housing were basically tenants of the local authority, so they could be told where to go as the upgrading happened. So obviously somebody said, right, somebody was allocated an older woman a first floor apartment that she could barely access, and so on and so forth. So they weren't given the right kind of apartments. But what was really happening here is, in fact, the eviction of undesirable residents from this area, right? So it was just a process of basically making sure that the area was, to use somebody there, cleaned up, right, of the undesirable residents. So it was really interesting for me, that cleaning up, looking at the maps of the area that were shown at the start of the regeneration process. And by the way, this is sort of remonte. So this is where they were saying where these houses in the area would be renovated. The green ones would be basically demolished. So they demolished a lot of housing and they moved people to another area, which was interesting to see that map, and then the map that was presented later as part of the revitalization process, where the housing that was demolished disappeared off the map, but it also looked a lot cleaner and greener and sort of much more slick, right? And you get this a lot in these renovation projects, that there is that sort of greenwashing underpinning it around what you actually and how you actually intervene in the space. So 29 buildings were fully renovated, given new energy efficient facades, given new energy efficient appliances. So that was the main thing. People were saying, we want to reduce people's energy bills, so we're doing all of this, right? Bizarrely, they still didn't get any district heating. So the district heating networks were not actually collectively expanded to this area. It was electrified. You could say maybe that is a good thing, right? In the fact that we are electrifying everything, that people saying it's a very good strategy, but the collective infrastructure, for me, it was interesting. The collective energy infrastructure of the city was never extended to the area. They did lots of forced residential moves in 2010 and 2011. And so 25 households were renovicted. So that's the process this the word we use to describe these dynamics. There was a renoviction process, right? There's a portmanteau of eviction and renovation. There were 43 households that were displaced indirectly, right? So that meant that people were, because of course, energy efficiency meant that prices were lower for energy, but rents went up, right? The social rents by the city, because they still charge social rents, went up, okay? And the other thing that the city did, because it really didn't like this municipal housing stock, the city didn't feel like it should be providing municipal housing. It was something difficult to manage from their perspective. So they moved the housing, and they also allowed for the construction of further housing by what are called TBS. So TBS are housing associations. So they're voluntary, not for profit, but still profit-making organizations that provide housing for particularly vulnerable, but also not so vulnerable residents. So this process, to me, exemplifies how low-carbon gentrification happens, because then in the further years, you had private housing coming into the area and further rising of rents, further expansion of private capital, further expansion of things that are not affordable for the people who lived there before. This is what the TBS housing looks like now. So if you went to this area now, you would never guess that 10 years ago, it looked like what it looked like, with all these old residents who'd been living there for some cases, families, for over 100 years. Right. So I should say that as part of, and I'm not going to go into detail, but as part of this process of finding out more about low carbon gentrification, we did a survey across lots of countries, and we found many other examples. And I will talk about one such example of renoviction in Sweden, in Stockholm, in Årsta, a neighborhood just south of the center of Stockholm. But we've also seen it happen a lot across Germany. It's the first time I noticed someone talking about this was at an energy efficiency conference where someone showed us a map. And it was shown as a good thing, a sort of in Freiburg in Germany of housing that was owned by the municipality, where as part of energy efficiency upgrades, the housing that had, for example, 7 units on one floor ended up having 4 units, which were all more expensive. So 3 families per floor had to be moved out, and guess which those families were? Obviously, wouldn't be the wealthier ones, right? And so this dynamic is happening in other places, and it's really, I think, is going to be accelerating, especially when you undertake low carbon interventions in this kind of context. I want to just highlight some of the ways in which, so I don't want to end on a pessimistic note. Maybe it sounds really glum for midweek lecture, so I want to try and end up on a more positive note, because there are groups, there are organizations, there are people who are actively resisting this, and there are people who are actively opening up the space of just transition. The Right to Energy Coalition, which I think some people in this room are also members of, for me is an example of how to do things well. It's a transnational organization that brings together trade unions, anti-poverty groups, social housing providers, non-governmental organizations, campaigners, practitioners, cooperatives, and so on. So it was established maybe now about 10 years ago. And what I love about the Right to Energy Coalition, it does many things at once. obviously within the capacity of its members, but it shows how you can't just be local, or you just can't. I mean, it's not just this like whatever, think local, act global, but they act at multiple scales. They influence multiple debates. They're always there when you have the European, well, not always, but they've frequently been there when you have the European Union Sustainable Energy Week, which is a very classic neoliberal forum where energy efficiency is discussed precisely in the way in which I described earlier, through markets, through behaviors, through technology, private intervention. So, you know, they're always there influencing and shaping the debate, or they organize their Right to Energy Forum, which gives you very, very open discussions around progressive action, but also a lot of their members are active locally and nationally through advocacy, through direct intervention. So for me, this is a really good example of how you can do things differently at different scales. The contestation of renovictions is another good example, and people are doing it. So going back to the case of Orsta, it's described in my paper in IJA. So that particular case was where you had a project called Go Green. Yay, fantastic. Grow Smarter, sorry. Grow Smarter. Go Green's another one. So Grow Smarter went into this area of primarily social housing in Orsta, very attractive area from a locational point of view, right next to Gamla Stan, the city center. And what they did was they said, we're going to put in smart technologies, we're going to put in all kinds of energy efficiency, blah, 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 all that sort of stuff. But they did it in a way that basically ended up evicting people and changing the nature of the neighborhood. What I loved about this particular case is that it wasn't met with complacency. People organized and they occupied a local theater, which is right on this photo behind us, on the screen. They managed to transform or to limit some of the interventions that happen. So in some cases, when this happens, it has to be resisted, but there has to be a local polity active around it, and there has to be a sense that things can be done in a better way, right? And there have been some really good, inspiring protests around this in Canada as well. LISC, which is the Local Initiatives Corporation in New York, is a not-for-profit organization, and their Local Initiative Support Corporation, they're great because I like their approach to energy efficiency. So their approach to energy efficiency is not just, it's called weatherization, it gets to be called weatherization in the US. It is not about private capital, it is not about profit, it is done in a way that works with local communities, that works with particularly disadvantaged communities, and leads to the whole interventions across the whole ecosystem of energy actors. So integrates difference and diversity in these interventions. Right, so conscious of time, what are some of the implications? How might we move forward? How might we challenge some of these practices that are gaining in speed and momentum in this just transition, Green New Deal, necropolitical future, right? How might we challenge them? So one thing is really to go to Spath and Rohracker to say, energy efficiency investment is a junction. It's a junction in the city, in the region. It is not in and of itself the target, right? It's just a way of creating new social and political relations. And that's something that creates new demands on actors. And people have to be acknowledging those political power dynamics that happen when we invest in energy efficiency. So being aware of the dynamics of power, being aware of the capitalist political economy in which this happens, and challenging that capitalist political economy seems very important to me. Something else, really, is to understand the role of the public sector, of the state, in facilitating, in supporting this process. And for me, it's central. The state, none of this would happen without the state. The state is the vehicle through which these just transitions happen. So we have to influence what the state does. We have to shape the state action, okay? Understanding the injustices that emerge through this process and also supporting those who are vulnerable seems crucial. So there are new injustices happening and we don't understand them very well. And we don't work with the people who are affected by these injustices. And there's an everydayness to this process as well, for when we start to build in flexibility, when we start to build in ascetization that is not well understood. And in that sense, introducing a non-conformist, the essential praxis to the transition, saying that transitions are contesting transitions at every point, understanding their politics, opening up their politics seems crucial to me. And here, for me, this is really important, is the idea that we have to understand the making of new energy resources through this stage. So what we don't appreciate is that we are creating, through just transitions, through Green New Deals, we are creating new energy resources. So we talk about, I'm listening to the debates, everyone talks about coal, oil, biomass, wind, what is it now? Solar. Nobody is talking about the making of energy efficiency as a resource. And that energy resource, this is, I've been talking about this in my progress paper, which is open access, so you can, again, recommending cures for insomnia here. But you can really, that energy resource is not a material one. That's something I want to really highlight. It is not something that is physical, but it's relational. It is made through a whole range of social and political processes around planning, governing, extraction, consumption, contestation, social reproduction. So the people who are doing the contesting of these resources are also part of the making of that resource in a particular way. So there was an intervention by Carlos Sica, who said in Environment Planning A, I think, who said gas is a labor-less fuel. Some fuels are labor-less. And I was sort of a little bit thinking, well, I think no fuel is labor-less because every energy resource requires different types of labor. And we have to acknowledge the labor that goes into all of this. And that labor is crucial. If we have to understand that labor, we have to foreground that labor if we're going to stop these injustices. Because a lot of the cases where the injustices are stopped involve the labor of activists, involve the labor of people who are trying to actively transform and shape these transitions in ways that are politically progressive. So these struggles that allow us these resources, as Idalina Baptista says, to be always in the making. Right. I think that's all. Thank you.